All right, well, I think we're going to get started. Again, my name is Emily Reiswig, and I'm the Director of Communications here at Openlands. And we're really excited to have you all join us today for this virtual nature walk and presentation on some of our restoration work in Deer Grove. I am going to pass it off to Ted, but before I do that, I just want to say if you have questions throughout the presentation and the nature walk, please put those in the chat and we'll stop after each habitat and go over some of the questions before we move on to the next part of the walk. Passing it off to you, Ted.
Thanks, Emily. Everybody can hear me okay? Awesome. So can I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, so for those of you who don't know us, thank you for joining us this evening. We're Openlands. We're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and our vision for the region is a landscape that includes a vast network of land and water trails, tree-lined streets, and intimate public gardens in reach of every city or town dweller. It also includes natural habitat and sufficient woodlands, vast prairies, and wetlands that were here before the cities. What we like to call the web of green in and around Chicago. We pride ourselves in having accessible nature and promoting accessible nature to every person where they live. And that's why we believe that it's important to protect open space, and that is critical for the quality of life in our region. With that in mind, this presentation that Linda and I are going to give you tonight will be hopefully some mental health benefits as we shelter in place, but also hoping that we can string together a series of educational moments for you to explain more in depth our work, specifically around one of our restoration projects at Deer Grove East. Next slide, please. Go ahead, Linda.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. Hi, I'm Linda Masters. I'm a restoration specialist with Openlands. I've been with Openlands since 2000, so I've been able to see some of these projects from the inception to reaching performance standards and now into continued stewardship, which is very exciting. This picture that you're looking at is an aerial photograph taken in 1938-39. The aerial photographs were flown throughout Illinois during the early 1930s through the 1930s, which are just invaluable to us as we plan our restoration projects. This is Deer Grove East. It's outlined in yellow. That's the preserve that we're working in on this project. And if you look closely, you can see where the remnant woodlands are. Let's see, do I have a pointer?
Yeah, go to view options.
View options.
And then there should be a suite of tools.
I don't see view options.
Oh, it's down at the bottom.
I don't see an option for anyway, so I will just try to describe. So on the, oh, there's something, but that's not mine. Anyway, so on the left-hand side, you can see the remnant woodlands, some buildings along Quentin Road. That's Camp Reinberg. When you move further east, you can begin to see farm fields. And if you get the chance to look at this, you can see some more closely, you can see some row crop agricultures. You can see some dots in the landscapes. Those are haystacks. So part of it was hayed. But you can see most of this area was in some kind of agriculture, either hay, farming, row crop ag. They drained a lot of it because a lot of this site is very wet. And we'll begin to take you through the process of how we began to restore this forest preserve to what it wants to be. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing, which is really important. Deer Grove was the very first purchased by the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. It was purchased 500 acres more to the west, was purchased in 1916. This, a little bit on the west side of this site was included in that 500 acres. But most of the rest of this site was purchased in, it was started to be purchased in 1931. There were some more purchases in 1960. And then there were actually some more additions in 2015. So yes, this aerial, so you remember the previous one, it was pretty farmed, pretty open. This is what the forest preserve looked like in 2005. So you can see that the woodlands have filled in. They've gotten, the canopy has closed a lot. They actually planted a bunch of tulip trees in their so-called reforestation areas. You can see that there are no, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see where it's kind of dark and mottled. Those were existing wetlands that were already there. That's a big cattail marsh. But throughout our project area, you don't see a lot of wet spots, not a lot of wetlands. So we knew that there were hydric soils. So we took a chance that we could restore some of those hydric soils back into wetlands. But as you can see right now, there aren't many. Ta-da! This is now an aerial of after restoration. You can see that we have begun to thin out the trees that were choked with buckthorn, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, the whole gamut of nasty invasive woody plants. We removed right where your red dot is and go up to the west of that wetland. That was where reforestation was. We removed about 50 acres of reforestation. We disabled the tile, which we'll get into a little bit later. And you can see these other spots that have become wetlands now. So we are keeping water where it rains on site. This project was funded by what we call the O'Hare Modernization Program. The wetlands at O'Hare were impacted by the expansion of runways, and so they had to mitigate for the loss of those wetlands. So we were lucky enough to be able to work within that account and work at several different project sites. We had 5 different project sites through that mitigation project, and one of them was at O'Hare. I mean, at Deer Grove. At Deer Grove. So this is sort of a description of what happened with that project at Deer Grove. Okay. And Ted.
So here you see a map overlay of all the wetlands in green on the site in their restoration final capacity. Basically what we did through the tile removal, which we will get into in a little bit, was to link all these wetlands together in terms of keeping them not isolated entities or not drained entities, to make them a fully functioning ecosystem, linking all these woodlands and prairies and wetlands together. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ecological benefits of retaining water on site later, but we just wanted to give you a very graphic overview of how the site works in concert with one another. And as we walk through and take you on a tour, we will annotate this and explain a lot more in depth about this project, but this gives you some context as to what we were trying to do by taking away the old farm field and restoring it to ecological health for a myriad benefits, which we'll also get into later. if you can't tell already, we have produced a program tonight in which we're trying our best to give information and also give you some mental health benefits of being outside. Here is video 1. And Linda, maybe as we go through video 1, maybe you can talk through some of the different landscapes that we see use, some of the dead trees in the background, and some of the art pieces and things like that.
Sure. So we were so eager to get out and film this that we got out a little bit early. So we don't have a lot of pretty flowers to show you, but that's okay. We have some other flowers. We'll show you later on. We have different, this is an interpretation node. There are 4 of these scattered throughout the sites. And these are really meant to draw people off the main trail, have a place to sit down, kind of reflect about what they're seeing or hearing in the landscape. This one is called Habitats. If you, yeah, so this one, when you sit down on these blocks, you can see wetlands, you can see woodlands, you can see prairie, sort of depending on which direction that you're looking. And there's sort of little thoughtful things to sort of prompt you to think about, sort of reflect on where you are and what you're looking at. You can see in the background that we had a wooded marsh back there, mostly cottonwoods. And when we changed the tile, the disablement of the tile and how the water flowed, the water table in that marsh rose and killed the trees back there. But since then, because that happened, it's become quite a hotspot for birders. We've got bluebirds, we have herons, we have red-headed woodpeckers, all sorts of things using that marsh. On the opposite side of the trail is what was once just a Eurasian meadow is now this beautiful spring-fed wetland surrounded by lily pads and bulrushes and all sorts of other great plants. Pie-billed grebes have nested here. It's a green, blue-winged teal. All sorts of birds love to use that pond. Lagoon, pond, wetland. Here, what I'm pointing at is before we started this project, standing on that trail, this was choked with buckthorn, and we'll show you some before pictures a little bit later. You could not see 3 feet into that woodland, and now you can see through it. You can see the wetland through it. The changes have been really pretty remarkable. Ted, did you have anything to add to this? You're muted, Ted.
As we're going along, there are a couple questions that are entering the chat room, and some of these we might point out at the next aerial map, which I think we have a couple more coming. One is somebody, Matt Myron, pointed out, I know some of the wetlands in DGE East bump up against pine forest. Can you point out where the pine forest is on the overhead map next time we get there?
Yes, I can. Yep.
I was also curious about why the wetlands were linked and some are not. And I think that really gets into water storage, which we'll get into in a little bit, but maybe Linda, you could give a precursor to that at this point right now.
Okay. There's a caveat. I just want to tell you that the video that you're watching right now, it was not on our walk. This is a video that we had already. So it's a little bit later in the season. Something you can anticipate looking forward to as you go out there and explore Deer Grove. The wetlands actually are linked naturally. There are just swales that, as we rehydrated the landscape, most of them were naturally kind of linked through woodland swales or prairie swales. There were some that the mosquito abatement had dug some ditches trying to drain them in the past, which we sort of left in place because they had stabilized. And we just allowed the site to kind of, you know, heal that process of wetland saturation. I think that explains it a little bit, but I think we can.
In one of the images later, we have some contours on them, so
We do.
we can display the landforms and show how that works.
Right. So in the video where you saw that large wetland area with the open water, that's where that tree was. There was an existing tiny little spring-fed pond down there. We removed these cottonwoods, disabled the tiles, and then we'll go through several before landscape pictures. This is what many of the ponds looked like when we first started working out there. They were surrounded by shrubby, probably not Rhamnus frangula and other kind of woody plants that like to get their feet wet. So this is a nice before picture of what many of the wetlands look like. We removed a lot of those shrubby plants that didn't belong there. And started planting around the wetlands. We started planting, we completed planting in like 2011. We continued with enhancement seeding and plugging for another 2 years. We probably planted about 83,000 plugs around these wetlands. So it kept a lot of college students busy for many summers, for a few summers anyway. And this is now several years, probably like 3 or 4 years later, as the vegetation has filled in, this is what the ponds look like today. There are about 23 distinct different wetland basins in this project. And some of them were already there, they were already in place, but by disabling 3,000 feet of drain tile, we were able to resaturate those hydric soils and ended up with 23 distinct different wetland basins. Some more beautiful pictures of after restoration. A nice stand of pickerel weed. We have some winged loosestrife out there and many other different types of wetland plants.
So here's a photo of the tile system. The tiles are actually in green, and what you see is the red triangles are the outlets of the tiles where they drain into and where we actually stop the removal. The orange lines all over the place are the sub-watershed delineations. The blue boxes are each of those 23 plus or minus wetland ponds that Linda talked about. And the orange is the overflow. So you can see that like over on the west side where the headwaters come up, they drain into this pond down here in the southwest corner, right around the red dot. The major work was sort of done in the central portion where that tree was standing that we removed and dug out those areas. And then those flow up north and east to the outlets where the project boundaries stopped. They're not all connected, but to Linda's point earlier, a lot of them are connected either by surface flow, which we'll get into. We'll show you a couple of those later on some of the video walks, but also by connected hydric conditions in soils and basins. And if you look really closely on this one, you see a series of white lines that show the contours. So especially right where the red dot is, you can see a lot of those white lines indicating high points or low points on the land, and the sub-watersheds sort of indicate where the water comes from and where it goes. I hope that helps your thinking, Pete, as to why some are connected and some are not. Linda, maybe we can also take an opportunity here to point out where those pines are that came.
since Ted is lucky enough to have a pointer, but I'm not.
No, it's
But-
actually Emily behind the scenes.
Oh, good, Emily, you're so good. So way up in the way on the top, sort of mid-range, right in the middle, you see there's sort of an island of green up there, a little bit more to the east, That's where the pine trees are. Those are the pine trees. And they're still there. And there's a trail that goes out there. If you like pine trees, there's many.
All right, I think we're good.
Do we want to, are there any other questions about?
Maybe take some questions and open it up if there are any questions on the chat or otherwise. I haven't seen any come in, but that doesn't mean that no current questions. All right, let's keep going.
Okay.
So this video and walk we're going to show you is the Prairie video. This site is really interesting because it has at least three different ecosystem types. And that's really important when it comes to climate change and restoration. Restorationists, to be successful, especially with a changing climate where you don't know what's going to come at you. We know rains are increasing. We know that forecasted increased heat is coming in. But these ecosystems allow for adaptability and species richness. So that really allows, if things dry up, the prairies and dry species can take over. If things get more wet, the wetland systems can expand to incorporate that and allow it to do it ecologically healthfully. So that's really important in terms of this context. Also, we see some summer views here of some, maybe, I don't know, I'm a landscape architect, so Linda might know this better than I am. But it's sawtooth sunflower, or rotitaba, or silphium. We also have some ironweed and bee balm. The bee balm is the light purple, the ironweed is the darker purple. Black-eyed Susan's in there with the dark spot in the center. And in one of these, you'll be able to see a goldfinch perching on one of the plants. And I'll say when it comes into view, but I think, maybe we'll just be quiet right now for a moment and let you appreciate the view as a mental health break. So a couple more questions are rolling in.
Okay.
Linda, some of them say, maybe I missed it, but what was the process for species selection, plugs and seeds, and what have we learned from the species and subspecies selection? Also, how does drain tile change the hydrology? Where does the water go? I can touch on that. And then somebody from Michigan has said, this is the first I've ever heard of Deer Grove. Did we have any public-private partnerships? So maybe we can get into that at the end as well.
Okay.
Goldfish finch in the center of the screen. Do you want to talk about some of the species selection, Linda?
So when we do the planning for projects like this, we studied this site for about a year, doing our due diligence, looking at the land, looking at pre-settlement information, looking at that 1938 aerial, studying the soils, what kind of soil, different types of soil develop under different types of vegetation. You'll have a different soil that develops under wetland, under prairie, under woodland, savanna. So knowing that and knowing the plants and what kind of habitats those plants like, we developed a series of probably 7 or 8 different lists of species for each community got their own species list. So we were very specific. When we determine what seeds, we look at a continuum from sun to shade and wet to dry. And we figure out that these seeds like sunny dry. They will go in this section, which is sunny and dry. These seeds or these plants like wet or semi-wet. And so we'll start to begin to sort the types of seeds. We purchase them individually, and then we make mixes depending on, is the site mesic? Is it shady? Is it wet? Is it emergent wetland? You know, all these different distinctions and community types. So we tailor the seed list very specifically to what we find in the landscape. And we really try to allow the land to speak for itself. We don't want to force plants to be where they don't want to be. So we really take a long time to study it. And then we're very specific about where we put those species.
So that's an interesting point, Linda, because that gets into some of that adaptability to climate change that I was talking about. Those pockets and those different hydrologic conditions allow seeds to move over time into those favored pockets, right?
Right.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
go ahead.
And we overlap when we seed. We always overlap that edge, right, between wet
Yep.
and dry. We always overlap, so there's kind of, you know, it's not just a specific line. So it's always overlapping. But does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think this gets into Julian's question a little bit. How does drain tile change the hydrology and where does the water go? So in my understanding of the sort of developmental history of Illinois in agriculture, basically the farm fields or the pre-existing conditions were really very rich and fertile, but also wet and swampy because Chicago is built on basically a big marsh or swamp. So really to be helpful in an agricultural way, they basically put drains, clay tile drains into the ground to allow the water to flow off site so they could more or less crop as much land as they could economically. So that's why they put the tiles in to get the water away so they could grow vegetables, corn, whatever their subsistence living was or whatever the market could bear at that point. Now, these days, it's corn and soybeans, but it wasn't predominantly that way in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But that really changed the hydrology of the land in order to be a food-bearing and fertile plot. Removing the tile allows us to find those different ecological conditions to bring natural habitat back, much, we think, to the way that it was before settlement.
Right, yes. Yeah, drain tiles, it allowed the farmer to extend their growing season. They could get in earlier in the spring to plant their crops, and they could harvest a lot later. So it was many acres and acres of wetlands were drained, as we know.
Want to point out some of the characteristics before the restoration and after the farming took place?
Yeah, so when this section was bought in like the 1960s, a lot of thought at that time is if you just protect it and leave it alone, it will be just fine. But what we have discovered since then is that if you leave it alone, what happens is that it's not just fine. Prairie does not just put itself back. You have to, if it's been farmed for a long time, all the original prairie plants, they're gone. So you have to prepare it in order to have a successful prairie planting. We removed a lot of those. You can see it was beginning to get shrubbed in by some evergreens back there. The foreground had lots of little shrubs, and this is what we call a European meadow. There are mostly Eurasian grasses and plants and shrubs that were invading this grassland, which was not benefiting many animals or insects or pollinators. It was just very dull and uninteresting, in my humble opinion. But when I see the results of what we've been able to do out there, it's just pretty amazing. Ted, was there another question that somebody had asked in the chat?
I think it was about the public-private partnerships, which we can get into later in some of the other explanations that I have upcoming. And
Somebody said, why leave the pine trees?
go ahead.
The pine trees were outside of our project area. So we defined our project area pretty tightly. We did 181 acres in this much larger preserve. A lot of people like pine trees. They are weird. They do have different kinds of animals, birds that like the pine trees, and they weren't hurting our project. So I would say if it were my property, I would remove the pine trees, but they're still there. So
there actually was another question, Linda. Emma asked if this would be considered an intact ecosystem, and from my landscape architecture point of view, I would say yes, but as a restoration specialist, you might have a different answer. I don't know.
My question would be, what is an intact ecosystem? What's meant by that? Do you know, Ted?
I don't. It was just a one-line question. Maybe Emma can follow up. And then the last one is that just came in. During restoration, have there been controlled burns?
There have been many. We have tried to burn at least part of this restoration every year. So on an annual basis, some part of this restoration does get burned every year. And some of the, where it gets burned sort of depends on the conditions, you know, which way are the winds blowing, how humid is it, what kind of burn season are we having. The prairies have probably burned more often than the woodlands because it's just it's just easier to burn. But yes, we do burn this. We have burned it every year since we started.
And we can talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the Savannah and the Woodland video tour that we have.
Yep.
Any other notes on the prairies before restoration? You see mowed grass in there. Maybe we go to the next slide. You could point out some other things.
Mm-hmm. So this is an after picture of what was planted. This was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And what's kind of interesting about this whole sort of restoration process is that each year is different, and we'll see different plants sort of dominate the landscape. And it takes probably a good 10 or 15 years for it to kind of settle down. But huge improvement over the pre-restoration prairie, I would say, with
Linda, something just came in from Jerome. He asked if we know about the increase in species diversity, and since this is going to Biodiversity Day,
yes.
Maybe talk about that a little bit and see if you have anything in your notes or memory about that.
So it has so what I don't have in my head or on my cheat sheet, which I have right next to me, I don't have the list of, we did of course do plant inventories before it got started. I don't have that information, but in 2015, we recorded 389 native species throughout our project area with a mean C of 4.8. And if people don't know what that means, each plant is given a number, each native plant in the Chicago region is given a number between 0 and 10. 0 means that you can find it just about anywhere, walking out your back door, down the street, whatever. A 10 means that you will only find it in a very specific habitat. So with a 4.8, that's getting pretty high. That's very impressive. With a floristic quality index of 94.7, which is remarkable because Jerry Wilhelm, who wrote the Flora of the Chicago region, has said in the past that restorations rarely get above a 35 floristic quality index, and this is a 94. Granted, we had some remnant areas, we had some good areas to start with, but that's pretty impressive. With 3, and that was 5 years ago, so I imagine that that's probably gone up even higher now. So 389 native species. I'm really proud of that.
You should be.
And on top of that, we have also done bird monitoring out here. And between the years 2011 and 2015, we recorded 25 birds species of greatest conservation need.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, Linda, because I don't know how many in our audience know about this resource, but eBird is a great resource. And eBird, this is an eBird hotspot, and there are a bunch of entries into eBird, even over the last month or 2 months, that have, I think, over 200 or 250 species recorded at Deer Grove East. And if you're interested in that, just Google eBird, and you can see some of the species that people have seen out there. And when we went out there, even on the last, a week ago, Tuesday, I think,
yeah,
we see easily 20 or 30 different birds, and we are not ornithologists or bird people. So I would, if for no other reason, I would highly recommend getting out to this site if you can.
It's become a destination for birders, definitely. So here's a couple of plants you'd see out in the prairie: prairie dropseed, shooting star. We've got some toadflax, the little white flowers at the bottom, along with some wood betony.
And are these growing now, or are these blooming now?
They're just starting, yes. They are coming up. These are things that you would see in the spring. A close-up of the wood betony. There's a swamp buttercup with a prairie trillium.
Which is the trillium, the purple?
The purple.
Yeah. Three leaves, right? Trillium?
Yes. Yeah. This is cream wild indigo, just starting to come up. This will be a really beautiful plant in about another 3 or 4 weeks. But these are little things that you can begin to see, and it's worth sort of bloodroot, phlox. It's worth going out to the prairie and the woodland several times during the season, because every time it's at a different stage, you see different colors, different flowers. It never disappoints. So that was the prairie. Are we caught up on our chat questions?
I think we are.
Okay, all right.
Which we'll deal with in a bit.
So, so this is on the trail. You can see this solid wall of shrubs, buckthorn, honeysuckle, whatever, growing in there. Just you could not see that wetland that was 20 feet away through that solid wall as you're walking along the trail. Again, another picture of what was there. When off the asphalt trail, there were some side trails into the woodlands that were very dark, very tunnel-like. You could not really see through the trail, through the trees. After
when you went out there, Linda, did you feel safe?
It was very no, because you didn't know who was coming up behind you. You couldn't see, you know, through anything. So if we go to the next, I think when we go to the video, you'll see the changes through the woodland, and you'll be able to begin to see now all that shrubby stuff is gone from the trail. You can see through the woods. As I worked out there, many people, especially of the female type, would say, "Oh, I thank you so much. I feel so much better. I can now jog through those trails, and I feel so much safer because I can see around me."
So this is an interesting shot. This is a little rivulet or stream that drains a wet area on the northwest corner of the site. And when we were out there, there's a little unpaved trail with a bridge that crosses it, and you can just peacefully hear this brook burble as you go along. So the mental health benefits of this are huge. But what's also interesting, and what we talked about as we were going over this bridge, is this idea of macroinvertebrates. These are little critters that are born in water, and this freshwater biodiversity is being lost at higher rates than any terrestrial biodiversity. Fresh water is a percentage of the Earth's surface is only 0.01%, but macroinvertebrates and the biodiversity found in freshwater is 6% of all species on Earth. And these macroinvertebrates both are involved in the aquatic food chain and the terrestrial food chain. So they're really important. And these little brooks and wetlands are really important, not just in the Chicago region with a lot of our spring-fed headwater streams, which we work to protect, but also to just life in general. They feed birds, they feed mammals, they feed fish. And it's really important that these ecosystems exist, especially given the percentages that I gave you earlier. Here we have a nice view of the canopy and how it's more open. It looks kind of closed. You can mentally picture these trees with leaves on them, but you'll see some shots later that show that the sunlight really does filter through. And so in addition to spring ephemerals, it allows for summer plants to pop up as well. This is a neat little sedge meadow or a sedge wetland. Linda, do you want to talk about this when you were?
Yep, so we cleared out all along this. Walking along that path, you couldn't get to it at all. So it's now open. Blue joint grass, tussock sedge, March beshling, Joe Pye weed, Marsh St. John's wort. It's a highly diverse, very high quality wetland area. You can see how the oaks like to lean over. We have a wonderful bur oak savanna on this site, and bur oak savannas are globally rare. They're globally imperiled, and we are lucky enough to have a pretty good one here at Deer Grove.
And that's because of the fire and the disturbance, right? That's really important systems, but also you can see the openness of the canopy allowing those shafts of sunlight in, right?
Yes. You can see the dappled sunlight reaching the ground, where before it was just bare dirt. You can begin to see the plants filling in the understory on the ground. This is what you want to see, and I think we have some a little bit later showing, just how flowery and pretty woodlands can be. They don't have to be bare dirt and buckthorn and multiflora rose, but you can actually see some nice plants coming in.
Well, and this gets to that point I made earlier about the different types of ecosystems on the site. Woodlands we're talking about, we have prairies, wetlands, and that species richness and interplay allows you to understand how with climate change, with increased heat, increased rains, all these different types of habitats can really weave together to help sites like this and societies like ours adapt to changing conditions.
Yeah. So more savanna-like, more open, lots of flowers around those trees. These are just some shots of after. Open grown trees, you can tell when you're looking at woodland restoration, you want to look for these open grown trees that when I say open grown, I mean trees that with limbs, lower limbs that reach out to the side. Those are trees that started growing up and living most of their lives in a lot of sunlight. Those are our open grown woodland savanna trees, as opposed to sort of these pole trees that I call them on the side, where they don't branch out until they're way high up. Those grow up in the dark. You can have flowers in a woodland. You'll see things like smooth Solomon seal, cow parsnip, that's just starting to come up, one of my favorites. Ruin anemone. Shooting star, that's one that can grow out in the prairie and the woodlands.
So we're going to take a little diversion here and talk about why this matters. And this matters because in terms of climate change, Openlands focuses on nature-based solutions. And the first biggest thing is to protect intact ecosystems. Those are places like the Amazon, the boreal forests up in Canada, the Great Plains, a lot of the Appalachia. But where those have been ruined, the next best thing you can do is to restore native ecosystems. And this is, quite frankly, one of the best examples of how you can do that. The third biggest effort is to improve practices on working lands, which I think is limited because it really applies to farming and agriculture and grazing and cattle and food production. But I would argue that even a city is a working land. We all live there, we all eat there, it's culturally significant to us. So that is a type of working land too, in terms of nature-based solutions to climate change. Next slide, Emily, please. Nature-based solutions to climate change are defined as those that use sustainable management and nature to tackle socio-environmental challenges. These are challenges like water security, water pollution, food security, human health, disaster and risk management, and yeah, climate change. Maybe even COVID-19, because we've seen a lot of intersections there as well. And these solutions are inspired and supported by nature. They're often cost effective. In Chicago, they would be urban forests that can help intercept rainwater and provide relief from urban heat islands. But in more rural areas, it's agricultural areas, it's cover crops and no-till, and in the in-between, it's restoring forest preserves like this. One of the biggest things here was to simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits that help build community resilience. That's what this diagram shows. Through improving nature, we can improve our own conditions and well-being. We remove the tile to increase water storage on site. Maybe next slide, Emily, please. So we did with our partners, and this was a huge public-private partnership. It went from federal funding to mitigate wetland removal at O'Hare, and then to restore these natural areas in the forest preserves. We had contractors, we had nonprofits, we had agencies, public, both civic and federal agencies involved, and state agencies involved. We were lucky enough to study some of the impacts of this project. In terms of water flowing off site, this chart on the top here shows that compared to pre-restoration conditions, we have basically retained 94% of the stormwater on site. That relieves downstream flooding, and that increases water quality through the water flowing through the wetlands and those rivulets and the plants and the roots. I think we underestimated at the early stages of monitoring this, the 40 million gallons a year that we save from flowing off site. I think it's probably more like 50 or 60 million gallons a year just by this restoration project alone. We were also able to do a cost benefit analysis. We looked at short-term costs, long-term costs. These factor in things like hiring contractors, visitation, people visiting Deer Grove. Visitation certainly increased, and we found that people were staying longer, going more frequently, and buying stuff on the way, maybe a picnic lunch or something. Those benefits have equated to over $8 in income for every dollar spent on this project. when you're talking about nature-based solutions, this project alone is one of the better examples of how we can restore our habitat and increase local socioeconomic conditions, as well as increase peace of mind, mental health, physical health. I think I've seen a couple of comments about how people go running there all the time. There have been a lot of bird comments. This is all part of this, and this is the power of nature-based solutions to our region. And really, when it comes to climate change, that's what that is the thing for which we advocate. Next slide, Emily.
So we're nearing the end of our presentation, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about monitoring and continued stewardship. When we started this project, we did a lot of the heavy lifting the first year, the clearing of the woodlands with using contractors with heavy equipment. Very, very soon after that, I think the year after that, we had a volunteer recruitment day. There was a pretty good volunteer group on the Deer Grove West, which is to the west of this project. But we needed to expand that volunteer group and to get people. There was no volunteer group on this side of Quentin Road, on the east side. So we had a recruitment day. We got lots of people very interested, started doing work days. And now that the Deer Grove East and West volunteers have combined into one very strong group, very effective group, who come out and do have work days on a pretty regular basis. We also have encouraged them to work closely with our contractors. So we have a really nice working relationship between staff, Forest Preserve staff, contractors, and volunteers all working together. The volunteers are the people who are out there the most often. They're the eyes on the ground. They know this site, you know, like the back of their hand. Some of them have divided the site up into zones and they do what they call weed scouting. And if they can take care of the invasive species themselves, they will. If it's too much, they take a point on iNaturalist, send it to what they call their weed czar, who then talks directly to our contractors. And our contractors don't have to spend a lot of time going back and forth looking for these. They can go right to that point and take care of the problem, you know, without having to hunt for it. So it's a wonderful relationship. It helps cut down the cost of these restoration projects, and it gets people. These projects need a constituent. They need a public. They need somebody to care about these places. So these people, when they adopt their site, they are, you know, that's their site. They become very familiar with it. And the staff, the volunteer, the Forest Preserve staff, this is all done, you know, with their help with planning and resources. You can see that we have a project area, that you can see the orange line. That's our project area. There's still a lot of work to do outside of the project area. We have been helping somewhat, but that's now the Forest Preserve is stepping in to begin to expand on our restoration project, to expand into unrestored areas. So it's just a bigger bang for your buck.
Hey, Linda, do you think that's because of the impact and effect of the original restoration we did about 5 or 7 years ago?
What's the bigger effect? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
The leaping of the bounds to restore the other areas.
Oh, oh, definitely. Yeah, when you see results, that I think that motivates people, and they start looking around and what else can we do? You know, we have this core area now that's you know, so well established, and yeah, so that they do begin to become more interested in what else needs to be done. You can see these red lines on this map. These are permanent transects that are placed in the landscape so that we can come back and continue to monitor the progress of the site. We have data from these transects for many years. We can go back in, 2 or 3 years, sort of measure to see how we're doing.
Well, and or measure issues that come up in changing climate, right?
Right. Yep. Adaptive management, right? You want these things to speak to you. Yep. One thing that happened, sort of as an aside, we were pretty efficient with our funding for this project. We had some money left over. So we, in the Forest Preserve, decided that we would spend a lot of that money on the west side of Deer Grove now. And we are now in the process right now of restoring another probably 250 acres on the other side of Quentin Road.
So all you runners out there, go find Deer Grove West and run through safer, more open trails, maybe.
Yes. So this is sort of a final closing shot. We have had sandhill cranes. I think the first one was seen in 2012. They've been seen every year since then. In one of our videos, you might have missed it because they were kind of small. When Emily and Ted and I were out there filming, we did see the 2 sandhill cranes out there on a hillside. So it's just wonderful that, that they discovered our Deer Grove East and are making a home for themselves and their families.
Hey, Linda, before we wrap up, there was a comment about why the parsnip and if it was original or introduced, because Tom Burke feels it can get kind of aggressive in his experience.
Well, it's easily seeded in. It was there, probably not very much. We definitely had it in our seed mix, and I wouldn't say it's not I've never. Yes, it can spread easily, but I would not consider it invasive or a problem.
Does that depend on the different hydrological conditions in that original sort of planting list that you came into? Searched?
Yes, and also keep in mind that these are very young restorations still, and plants can sometimes come in waves. They sort of, like, one year you have an explosion of, mountain mint or something else, and then next year it's gone. One year we had like little blue stem. I thought it was going to take over the whole entire place and be nothing but little blue stem. Well, that now has receded. So I think these things, this is a pretty young restoration. There's a lot of observations to come and things that will surprise us into the future.
So if someone in our audience wanted to go there, how would they figure out how to get there, driving directions, whether it's open Memorial Day weekend because it's a Cook County Forest Preserve or not, or is there another way to get involved? Softball question.
Well, on the next slide, you can always volunteer at Deer Grove. The Deer Grove Natural Area Volunteers have a website, and they have a Facebook page, and so you can always get involved that way. If you go to Openlands website, we have a page, I think, with maybe Emily can talk a little bit more about this with our Get Outside map, and we have a description of Deer Grove on as a page on our website.
Yeah, it is also, we're celebrating International Day of Biodiversity, but we're also celebrating American Wetlands Month. So if you go to our website, openlands.org, you can find a blog where we talk about 7 wetlands in our region that you can visit to experience this ecosystem. And we also have the Get Outside map that has over 350 locations that you can explore and visit from the comfort of your own home. There are beautiful pictures and videos on our website, or safely social distancing with your mask at natural areas that are open across the region. We do want to just point out too that this program is in coordination with the initiative 50 Days of Chicago Nature. It's an initiative to get more people out into nature right now and explore it in your own backyard as well. So if you see nature in your neighborhood or when you're out in natural areas, we encourage you to hashtag Nature Loves Chicago or tag them at that information below, especially for Biodiversity Day tomorrow. That'll be a big push.
So I also would miss and not pointing out that Ann Stake says, email us at deargrovenav.gmail.com to be added to the volunteer contact list if you want. I know we're coming to the end of our hour. We actually ran 4 minutes over, which we did not expect. Maybe we'd be stick around for 5 minutes or 10 minutes if other people have questions. We're always happy to help out because we have a passion for this, and this is needed, especially in times like this where we realize our environment matters. If anybody has other chat questions or anything else, we can stick around. If not, thank you so much for participating and coming and listening to this really rough cut, but successful in my mind, hour-long seminar.
Yes.
And I got something out of it in terms of pretty landscapes and some education. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, I'm seeing 9 new messages.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thank you all.
And Emily,
Perfect.
this is being recorded. Will it be available?
This is being recorded. If you have questions that we didn't answer, you can definitely email us, info@openlands.org, and we'll get those answered. But we'll send out the email for Deer Grove volunteers as well as the recording of this conversation in a follow-up email in the next day or two.
Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Yes, please come out.